Welcome to the Books and Travel podcast. I'm j.f.penn, thriller and dark fantasy author, bringing you escape and inspiration about unusual and fascinating places, as well as the deeper side of books and travel. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page, and if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my ebooks for free at j.f.penn.com/free. Hello travellers, I'm j.f.penn, and in today's interview I'm talking to Laura Morelli about how the artisans of Italy inspire her historical fiction, and also her travel books on how to shop for things like glass and paper in Italy. So we focus particularly on Venice, which I've done a solo episode on before, as well as Florence, and I particularly enjoyed hearing about the gondola makers. Now, it made me think about what I buy when I travel, and mainly it's food, because I love food, or experiences. And I love to go, like, for example, we cycled down the southwest side of India a few years ago and didn't, buy much other than food. And sometimes I'll buy some sarongs, stuff like that. But I prefer to take photos rather than buy souvenirs. But I do have a couple of things that I've bought on trips that have great meaning to me. I have a carved wooden Madonna figure from the West Bank of Israel, which I bought on my trip there in my teens, which I talked about in episode 1 when I first went to Jerusalem. And it's not a great carving, as I didn't have much money, but it represents a point in my life when I had a certain faith and I went to a place that meant a lot to me. So I still have that. I also have, and I have it here in my office, I have a mulga wood rainbow snake from Uluru, once called Ayers Rock in Australia. And I'll talk about that when I do my solo show on Australia, which will be coming up soon. But the snake, I had kind of a spiritual experience there, and the snake represented, I think my totem animal was probably a snake. So I'll talk about that. And also down in our lounge, I have a Turkish kilim, which I picked up when backpacking around Turkey in the mid-1990s. And my wonderful boyfriend at the time, I think I bought it in on the south coast there, and my boyfriend carried it in his backpack around for a couple of weeks, and so I'm very grateful to him. But the kilim actually features in Morgan's office in Stone of Fire. It's on the floor of her office, and of course it gets covered in the blood of the bad guys pretty quickly, but it is in the book. And I do put these things into my novels, some of the important things that I see or that I own. So yeah, that made it into Stone of Fire. So what we buy on our travels can definitely come back into our writing, and meeting people along the way can help us tell our stories. So what have you brought back from your travels, or is there something you'd like to buy from an authentic artisan to mark the places you have been? So whatever that might be, I hope you enjoy the interview with Laura today. Dr. Laura Morelli has a Ph.D. in art history from Yale, writes award-winning historical fiction based on the true stories of art history, and teaches art history online. Welcome, Laura.
Hello, Jo. I'm so happy to be with you.
It's great to have you on the show. So start off by telling us what inspired you to study art history in the first place. Tell us a bit more about your background.
Sure. Well, I'm a Southern girl. I grew up on the coast of Georgia, and I was very lucky at a young age to have the opportunity to travel. And I can remember that when I was growing up and people would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I always said that I wanted to be a writer or an archaeologist. And so I feel like I was fortunate to be what I set out to be when I was a little girl. But I went to Europe when I was about 12 for the first time. And I remember standing in front of the facade of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and just feeling spellbound in front of that Gothic cathedral. And I think that the architecture of medieval and Renaissance Europe really sparked a passion for me it lured me to continue to travel. And I always tell the silly story about when I was 16 and I went to Venice for the first time, and I fell prey to one of those hawkers in St. Mark's Square, one of those guys that used to hang around and lure unsuspecting Americans onto boats to head over to the island of Murano to buy Murano glass. And even at a young age, I had this idea that, I'm supposed to come home with Murano glass, but I had no idea why. But there was something about the artistic traditions from centuries ago that really sparked a passion and lured me to continue to travel and want to know more. And so I sort of put my dream of being a writer on the back burner for a little while because I wanted to follow that trail of art history. And so I went on to pursue advanced studies in art history and have taught at the college level. And I still have a passion for it. I think it's just the most interesting topic in the whole world.
Oh, that's so amazing. And I'm really interested, before we get into Venice and your books, what is because I know lots of Europeans who love art history. My dad actually did art and taught art history. And but to hear someone from Georgia who loves kind of European. So what are the big culture shocks, I guess, for an American out of Georgia going to Europe?
Oh gosh, so many. So, here I am, just a farm girl, but it's interesting. I think that, all Americans can relate to the idea of, having such an old past. There's something about feeling connected to people from long ago that I think we're missing a little bit in American culture. And I think we're missing, that distant past, those medieval ancestors, and so I think that feeling connected to your ancestors and to people from long ago is something that is probably just inherent in being human. And there's part of it, I think, that's missing a little bit in American culture. And certainly, the artists and the artisans that you see working in Europe, those kinds of things are missing, or they're not the same in North America. And so it is a culture shock for sure. But for me, it was a realization, I think, that there was meaning there, that there was meaning in art and that art was really important. And so that was something that really sparked an interest in me to pursue that further.
So you mentioned Venice, and you have 2 novels and a short story set in Renaissance Venice. So tell us about some of the places in Venice that you particularly love, where you can see behind the tourist stuff to the history.
Right. Well, as you know, Venice has become insanely crowded in recent years. But luckily, there are still quiet corners of the city, and there are places where you can still find these old world craftsmen and craftswomen hard at work creating authentic things like Murano glass or carnival mask, marbled paper, handmade leather book bindings. Now, if you've been to Venice, you'll say, oh, well, you can see the glass and the mask everywhere. And that's true, but they're only actually a few places where these really authentic artisans are making everything by hand and in a traditional way. Some of these are multi-generational family enterprises that have been in business for several hundred years. And so when I set out, 2 decades ago now, to rediscover some of these artisans, that was what really lured me. And so in Venice, there are places, lace, for example, on the island of Murano, glass, of course, on the island of Murano. There's several mask shops that are still in operation after many generations in the more main part of Venice. And then my favorite, there are gondola makers in several sections of the city. There are only 2 gondola boat yards that are still in operation where the guys are making every single part of the gondola by hand. There are many gondola workshops across the Venetian lagoon, but most of the artisans are using electric tools, modern woodworking tools, which is fine. But there are a couple of these squari, these old boatyards, where the artisans are still turning out gondolas 100% by hand. So if you know how to locate these artisans, it's such a fabulous immersive cultural experience. You go beyond the major sites, you go beyond the tourist traps, and you can really make a connection with someone who's doing something important, doing important work, someone who's passionate about what they do, and someone who's very excited to share it with you as a visitor. And some of these are still really quiet little corners of Venice, and that's one thing I love about it.
So how have some of those artisans inspired your novels? Do you kind of meet a gondola maker and decide to put him in a novel? Or tell us a bit about some of those artisan characters, I guess.
Yeah, so I started out, as I mentioned, teaching art history at the college level, and I became interested in these Italian artisans, and I wrote a book called Made in Italy about 20 years ago. And since then, I've written Made in Venice, Made in Florence, Made in Naples and the Amalfi Coast. And so when I was in Venice and doing research for the original edition of Made in Italy, I spent a lot of time talking with the gondola makers. And then as I went across the Italian peninsula, I heard the same story over and over again. So what people said was, it's so important to us to pass on this torch of tradition. We really feel that it's critical that we show our skills to the next generation, that we teach our children, that we bring our children and we bring our grandchildren into this trade to keep it going. And so I heard it so many times that I thought, gosh, what would happen if the heir was not willing or not able for some reason to carry on this torch of tradition? And this story sort of popped into my head about this heir to this gondola boatyard and a complicated relationship with his father. And so my first work of historical fiction, The Gondola Maker, is based on that idea in that story. So my fiction is very much rooted in my nonfiction research. And so that's been a lot of fun to go back and forth between nonfiction and fiction, because sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and that just makes a great nonfiction book. Sometimes you only know up to a certain bit, and then beyond that, we don't know. And then, of course, that's where the story comes. That's where the fiction begins. And that's a whole different can of worms and so much fun.
So what are some of the other places that have inspired your fiction? Because what I love about Europe, I think I lived, in Australia and New Zealand for 11 years. And one of the things I missed was that kind of historical architecture that you can actually see in the modern day, that you can set things there in your books, knowing that building would have looked pretty similar, however many hundred years ago, or sometimes thousands of years ago. So what are some of the places, either in Venice or other places in Italy, that you've put into your books that you kind of see the history?
Well, currently I'm finishing a novel that's based on the history of Michelangelo's David, or based on the story of its creation. And as you may know, that sculpture is really closely tied to the city of Florence. And so you can't really talk about Michelangelo's David without talking about the history of Florence around 1500. And, it was a very public work of art, and just like a work of architecture. And so certainly that has formed some inspiration. Let's see. I've also been writing more about painting recently, which has been interesting. I have a book that I'm working on around Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with the Ermine, and what happened to that picture in subsequent centuries. So it's not only places, but also works of art that were created in certain places and times.
So interesting. You mentioned David there. I really, in the building where it's displayed, they have also the slaves coming out of the blocks.
Right.
which I kind of love those even more in a way, because they feel like David is so perfect, you know, he's just amazing. And then there are these slaves that are kind of crawling out of these blocks of marble, and they
in Venice.
No, in Florence.
In Florence, okay. Yeah. There are those famous slaves in the Ferrari Church in Venice, too. I don't know if you saw those when you were there, that are just incredible, these gigantic figures.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, Florence also has all those sculptures in the main square, doesn't it? Which are just amazing to look at. And I love sculpture. It's one of the things I enjoy the most, I guess, about art. But I also have been looking at some of your blog posts. You've got this fantastic article on Venetian paper and bookbinding. And when I've been to Venice, obviously, and I've talked about it on this podcast, but I have bought a journal in Venice. So what is the history around the sort of bookbinding and paper? Why is Venice important there?
So Venice occupies a really important part of book history, which I think not many people are aware of. And, you know, again, it's just a way that you can explore Venice in differently than other travelers are doing, you know, if you focus on bookshops. But Venice used to be the gateway between the East and the West. And so it was kind of a natural place for book production to take root, because Venetian artisans were already very good at gold leaf and leather and paper making and all of the trades that go along with book production. And it just so happens that economically, politically, geographically, they were also really well positioned for some of the earliest bookmakers who came after Gutenberg, who came after the printing press, and they were able to publish and distribute books widely throughout Europe. And so the Venetian artisans really were well known for bookbinding, and the trade of bookbinding and publishing then sort of filtered south from there into Florence and other parts of Italy. But certainly Venice played an important role. There were several artisanal bookmaking and bookbinding shops in Venice up until recently. In recent years, unfortunately, a couple of the really historic bookbinders closed. I was so sad. But you can still go to Venetian bookshops and buy individual folios, little pages that were torn out of historic books long ago, and you can buy them and have them framed or something like that. And they make wonderful souvenirs. And certainly English people have been bringing home things like that from the Italian peninsula for a couple hundred years already, right? The grand tourist.
Oh yeah, the grand tour is a big thing. Well, it's interesting. I mean, you also one of the other thing that is kind of that Venice is famous for are the carnival masks. And you and I are both interested in the plague period, and yes. In one of my most recent novel I'm writing is called Map of Plagues, and there is a plague mask in it. So you know, what's happening with those masks? I mean, the carnival is kind of a trope in a way. Is it all just a tourist trap, or are there still artisans around those masks as well?
There are many masks, unfortunately, in Venice today that are imported from elsewhere and passed off as authentic. And so that's one of my missions in my guidebook series, is to lead people beyond the tourist traps to discover the more authentic makers. There are a handful of excellent mask makers in Venice. They're an affordable, portable souvenir. You can take mask making classes, which is super fun. And specifically about the plague doctor mask, which is really one of my favorite things ever. It was not originally intended for carnival. Its use as a carnival mask is a modern thing. But the plague doctor mask was actually invented in the 1600s by a French doctor who was looking to curb the contagion across France. And so he invented this mask, and the Venetians, being mask wearing, for many centuries from Carnival, just latched onto it immediately. But the idea was to push various medicinal herbs down that long beak bird-like nose, and that was supposed to, they believed, help protect the doctor. And he also wore a long cloak and gloves, and he carried a cane so that he could sort of flip people over and examine their buboes without getting infected himself. So it's a very scary looking mask. A lot of people find it very creepy, but it has a really cool history.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is super, super creepy. And I think that's the other interesting thing about Europe. And, we were saying before we started recording that there is always a dark side to these ancient cities because people have been living and dying there for, a long, long time. So what are the are there any interesting things you found that have inspired your stories in the darker side of Venice or Florence or Italy in general?
Yes, I have 3 different short stories that are set during plague times, including one that you can download free from my website that's set during the 1610 plague of Venice. It's called Bridge of Sighs, and you can get that free on my website at lauramorelli.com. I also have the first novel in my Venetian Artisans series is called The Painter's Apprentice, and it's also set during the 1510 plague of Venice. So I find it interesting how people dealt with challenges in the age before modern medicine, and I do think it makes for an interesting setting and set of challenges for a fictional character.
Yeah, because I've in writing Map of Plagues, you realise that it would have been like one of our sort of post-apocalyptic movies, so many people dying and not being able to do anything about it. So have you discovered any other interesting places in Venice that are related to the plague?
There is the Lazzaretto Nuovo, which is the plague island off the coast of Venice. There is one vaporetto that goes there, I think, one day a week. It's not very easy to get to, but you can actually visit one of the buildings that was used as a plague hospital in pre-modern times. And it was a quarantine island. It was a place where ships would be docked off the coast. In fact, the word quarantine is a Venetian word because a quarantena was 40 days. And so the ships had to stay off the shore there for 40 days to make sure that no one was sick. And then they would allow them to come into the ports of Venice. But you can visit this plague island, which is very interesting. And if you are interested in the dark side of culture, that's a great place to visit.
Oh, yeah.
You need to go there.
Oh, yes. I haven't been to that one. But in London, of course, we have a ton of plague pits. So, right. That you dig down in the ground in London and you hit a plague pit, which is quite hilarious. But getting back to your buying book. So you have these shopping guides, which I think are brilliant because one of the things that, as you said, your first experience in Venice, and certainly mine as well, is getting ripped off in the tourist traps. So if we want to buy something that is, truly artisanal and we have some budget, because I think it's important to note that if you want something good, you're going to pay for it. What should people do in terms of, trying to find those?
Yeah, so I think that authentic souvenirs don't necessarily have to be expensive. Some of them are quite affordable, but I always tell people it might just be the most quote unquote valuable thing that you bring back from a trip, not in monetary terms, but if you go to an artisan studio, you come face to face with the maker of your souvenir, you might be involved in choosing some aspect of it. If you go, for example, to Positano and you have leather sandals made, you can choose what color leather you want, what color sole you want. You can talk to the person who's making it. They're not super expensive. You can come home with not only a great, authentic Italian souvenir, but you can make a connection with the person who made it. And to me, that's part of the most valuable part of traveling overseas is that cultural interaction. And so, as I say, it may just be the most valuable thing that you come home with. That's really the best way to avoid getting ripped off is just to buy directly from the source. You get the best possible price, you meet the person, and you're buying something authentic. So definitely go to the artisan studios. And I've never found anyone who was rude or felt like they were being interrupted. As you probably know, Italians are extremely friendly and so happy to share their work and their passion with you.
And I think you're right there. I mean, another tip is don't buy anything in St. Mark's Square or any of the streets directly around it.
Absolutely. No, do not buy anything right around the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the Colosseum, cruise ship ports. That's kind of common sense. But beyond that, sometimes it can be a little overwhelming. I think people, for example, one of the slipperiest slopes in Italian shopping is buying leather in Florence. That's really tricky to get right. And so there are a lot of tips and tricks to it. So if you want to know more, you can check out my shopping guides. Everything's at lauramorelli.com. If you're going to Venice or Florence or Rome or Naples or the Amalfi Coast, Sicily, Sardinia. I've covered all the regions.
Oh, yeah. And next time I go back, I'm taking your carnival mask thing. I'm going to get one. I was just like, because whenever I've been, in fact, I found a really good shop with kind of steampunk carnival masks. Yes. And I wish I'd have bought one. I saw one and I was like, oh, why do I need one of those? And it's not about need. It's about artistic appreciation. Let's put it that way.
Those are really fun. And, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to buy one that's, authentic to 1700. I mean, you can buy something like a steampunk mask that's really fun. Yeah. That's completely handmade.
Absolutely. And then I did want to ask you about limoncello, because you did put that on your website. Tell people what limoncello is. I mean, personally, I don't like it, but tell us about it.
So limoncello is one of the joys of the Italian table. And if you've ever traveled, especially in the South, they bring it to you at no charge to your table after dinner. And it's a wonderful digestivo after dinner drink. You probably don't like it because maybe you didn't have a really good one. The bottles can vary so dramatically from one bottle to the next. And if you get a bad bottle, it tastes like window cleaner.
Yes. Or cough medicine.
Or cough medicine. But if you get a good bottle, it tastes like you're drinking a ray of sunshine or something. It has this wonderful flavor. So the lemons are, they're grown in a protected area along the Amalfi Coast in Capri, just south of Naples. And there are a couple of different varieties of lemons. And just like grapes and vinegar and some of the other world-class culinary products of Italy, they're protected by the government and by the region. They are really, limoncello is really nothing more than lemon peels, sugar, and alcohol. And that's it. And so it's a really simple recipe, but like most Italian cuisine, the simplicity of it is deceptive because, as I said, there's a huge range of quality and taste and flavor and family secrets and things that go into it. People have different types of lemons that they use, different types of alcohol they use. Some might put it in a cellar, some might put it in a closet. There are all these little very well kept family secrets around limoncello. Some of the larger producers have tours. You can go in and watch the machines and the bottles going through. But there are also smaller producers in the area and families. If you go to Amalfi or Sorrento, there are lots of shops selling limoncello. It's very inexpensive. You can just go have a seat and try and taste test. I can hardly think of a more fun thing to do on a hot, sunny afternoon.
I think I'll stick to my gin and tonic. But no, that's fantastic. And I definitely, everyone has to try it. If you're in Italy, you have to have a couple of limoncellos. It's part of the deal, really, isn't it?
It is. And, fun fact is it was probably invented by a group of nuns on the Amalfi Coast, which I absolutely love. They were known for these drinks called rosoli, which were kind of medicinal, hardcore alcohol that they would give to people who came into the convent who were sick, because certainly in the late Middle Ages and even later, anyone who was sick was going to the monastery or the convent to get medical care. And so it's believed that some of these liqueurs that are famous around the Amalfi Coast came out of that tradition of the convent and their medicinal liqueur.
Oh, that's cool. It's a bit like Belgium, where it's famous for the monk's beer that they make there. Yeah, there you go. It's very important. Okay, so a bit of a broader question. What does travel mean to you? I guess, someone who's from Georgia, what does travel mean, and how does travel inspire your writing?
Oh, so in so many ways. I mean, I always feel inspired when I go somewhere new, and it helps me, see my own home in a different way. And I think our brains are kind of wired to look for the familiar and for, what's similar and what's different. And I had an interesting experience recently. I was in Venice, and I flew out of the Venice airport, and I looked out the window at this vast, sparkling lagoon with all of these low-lying sandbars and, just the sea that seems like it's going to threaten to overtake everything. But yet so beautiful and so fragile looking from the air. And then some hours later, I landed just, at a small airport near my home and on the coast of Georgia, and I live on a barrier island. And so when you look out the window, there's that beautiful sparkling sea and those low-lying sandbars and that fragile environment. And so it's just fascinating to sit and I thought, wow, I went to another world and to, another place, to this mythic Venice. And then I came home to this very familiar place that also, from the air just looked almost like Venice. It was a really interesting parallel that I had never really seen before. So I think seeing the world from the air like that is inspiring in itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And while you were talking, it got me thinking, you talked about the difference, the things that are different, and you notice the things that are different when you're not from that place. This is something I'm kind of obsessed with at the moment is, can you write more effectively about a place or not effectively, but the writing of a native person? So you're writing about Georgia, for example, and then if I wrote about the same places in Georgia as an outsider, do you know what I mean? It's sort of you writing about Italy. You're not an Italian. You're not from Venice, but you're writing about Venice, and you see things as an outsider that people who are Venetian don't see. So does that resonate? That kind of the difference is important to see as an outsider.
Yeah, 100%. I understand what you're saying. I mean, you may know the work of Frances Mays, the author of Under the Tuscan Sun. She is also from South Georgia and also has a passion for Italy. And, the way that she writes about Italy is very much like you're describing. She sees the things, from an outsider's point of view. And but yet she just recently published a book called Under Magnolia that is a memoir about her life in Georgia. And it was so interesting to read it because, of course, then that's my world. That's what I'm familiar with. And yet she was able to write about it in the same way and in this beautiful language and seeing it almost like an outsider. And I thought, wow, I'm not sure I could do that. I'm not sure I could write about my own home and my own place in the same way that I could write about a place that feels so foreign and different. So it is a really interesting idea. I mean, people say write what you know, and I'm not sure that's exactly right in every case.
Oh, no, I think it's write what you're interested in,
Yes,
like we're both interested in the plague. We don't have to have the plague to write
no,
about
heaven
it.
Forbid.
Absolutely. Okay, so apart from your own books, what are some books you would recommend that either talk about art history or travel or Venice, if you like?
So there's so many books that I love that are historical novels based on works of art. And there's really a long tradition of these. If you may know The Agony and the Ecstasy from the 1950s that was about Michelangelo. But some of the more recent versions of art historical novels are some of my favorites. Tracy Chevalier's Girl with the Pearl Earring, Susan Vreeland's The Passion of Artemisia, Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch. These books that have works of art at the center are just really my kind of read. So I really enjoy those.
And I think I'll put Under Magnolia on there as well, because that's, it's funny, we're talking about Italy and now I'm thinking about Georgia. Which is what's so great about this show. You get ideas of lots of different places. Because, of course, to me, Georgia is foreign. Right. I've been to the South, and it is quite different, and what's so funny, actually, you'll laugh at this. I've been sick, like my stomach gets sick when I'm in the South of the USA, whereas I've traveled to India and I just am fine. So it's really interesting what's foreign to us and what's not.
Right. Maybe it's too much barbecue or cheese grits. I don't know.
Exactly. But no, that's fantastic. So where can people find you and your books and your courses online?
You can find everything at lauramorelli.com. You can download the free short story there. You can take a look at my books. You can sign up for an art history class. I'm just about to launch a new course on the ancient Etruscans, which I'm super excited about. So if that rings any kind of interest, then come on over and take a look at that.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time, Laura. That was great.
Thank you, Jo. I enjoyed it so much.
Thanks for joining me today on the Books and Travel podcast. I hope you found a moment of escape. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page. And if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my books for free at j.f.penn.com/free. Happy travels until next time.